thanks everyone for being here today. It's an absolute honour and pleasure to present a report for 4 members of Dáil here today. I feel as though roles are a bit reversed because it's usually journalists listening to politicians pontificating, so it's great to lecture politicians for a change. But in all seriousness, I really want to thank Mattie McGrath and some of the other rural independents for their tireless dedication and effort in highlighting the plight of homeowners whose mortgage generation rent. But this issue impacts not just urban communities, but rural ones too. The plight of indebted homeowners and left behind youths does not discriminate, and it's vital that we come up with solutions, but also understand how we got into this situation. So just a bit of background on myself. I am a journalist by trade and have written extensively about issues impacting my generation, from housing to an inability to move out of our parents' house. So we all understand the struggles facing young people. People in their mid-20s to early 30s, equipped with a degree, wealth, and material items that previous generations would have dreamed of, yet still cannot find a place to call their own, and forced to either live at home with their parents or be afforded the privilege to pay sky-high rents instead. Now the figures speak for themselves. In 1993, over 70% of 25 to 34-year-olds owned their own home, the majority with a mortgage. But in 2016, that figure fell to less than a third. As home ownership has plummeted for young people, the proportion of young renters has skyrocketed. In the early 90s, a mere 15% of 25 to 34-year-olds were renting. But in 2016, that figure increased to 60%. According to the 2022 census, over 2/3 of 18 to 34-year-olds still live at home with their parents. Relative to average wages, Irish rents are some of the highest in the world. Since 2013, wages have risen by 27%, while rents have risen by 90%, with property prices concurrently rising by 75%. But how did we get into this mess? You know, often we're told it's a lack of supply. If only we got the supply question sorted, we'd get to the bottom of our housing woes. But anyone can tell you that during the Celtic Tiger, Ireland was building more homes per capita than any nation on earth, yet house prices still rose. Currently, we are facing a housing market in which a constant stream of build-to-rent properties is creating an underclass of forever renters who will own nothing and be happy. Last year, over 90% of housing supply in this very city, Dublin, was built to rent, with average prices ranging from £1,000 to almost £2,000. It seems government policy is currently facilitating the generation rent phenomenon. This is a far cry from years past, when Ireland was an outlier globally in home ownership. In 1971, home ownership in Ireland was 68%, compared to 35% in Sweden and 50% in the UK. So what happened? Now, loath as I am to kind of morph into Vladimir Putin and impose a historic diatribe on you here today, I feel it's constructive to kind of briefly examine the history of housing in Ireland to contextualise the current situation. So during colonial times, Ireland's land was seized and plundered through a series of land grabs from successive British administrations. The names stand out: Oliver Cromwell, Henry VIII, and this led to a deep sense of housing and land insecurity on the part of Irish Catholics, accelerating their longing for autonomy within these isles. The Land League and other grassroots, rural and urban efforts to campaign for dispossessed landowners through agrarian upheaval helped accrue major concessions on the part of the British administration that saw previously indebted smallholders granted their lands with cheap loans from the British Treasury. The early Free State was defined by this historic dilemma, with a series of land amelioration measures such as the cessation of land annuities, mass arrears forgiveness, and other land acts, which showed what can be achieved with grassroots action and political will. When Ireland did gain its independence, the state underwent a massive home building effort, despite being a developing and poor country. The £1 Million scheme saw the construction of 2,000 homes nationally. The Housing Acts of 1931 and 1932 saw from the early 1930s to the 1950s over 100,000 social homes built. But how did they do this? How did we manage to construct more homes then than now? By localising the provision of housing to county councils or corporations with the supplication of low-cost loans to builders and low-cost mortgages to purchasers, the Irish state fulfilled that vital social element to housing. However, by the 1970s and early 1980s, a major global shift in how housing was viewed would occur. No longer would a home be considered a mere home to start a family in or fulfill a social purpose for the common good, but rather it would serve an asset function. Ireland was not immune to the end of society, heralded by Margaret Thatcher, the non-interventionist approach championed by Ronald Reagan. Right to buy in the UK would see social housing in private hands without being replaced. Meanwhile, Ireland had already adopted its own right to buy in 1966, however, had been replacing it for the most part with extra social homes. As such, successive governments would proceed to disempower the hitherto powerful county councils in providing homes and rely on private forces for the provision of housing. In the early 1980s, local government accounted for a quarter of mortgages, but by the end of the decade, this accounted for 2% and has not recovered since. Most mortgages would be provided by banks. These mortgages were in turn heavily deregulated and privatised. Irish deregulation involved the removal of capital reserve requirement ratios and unlimited credit growth for banks and building societies. And then eventually cross-border borrowing meant that banks were no longer reliant on customer deposits to lend, known as fractional reserve lending, but rather could borrow short-term, one-year maturity from the international money markets and sell long-term to customers. Now, when Ireland joined the Eurozone in 1999, this asset function accelerated. Having been accustomed and used to high interest rates, the cost of mortgages dropped dramatically, making it easier to borrow for a mortgage, with Irish banks offering mortgages almost 20 times people's income. Bank lending rose from 60% of GNP in 1997 to 200% in 2008. This was a period in which housing supply was at its zenith. However, this supply was merely enabling the further financialisation of housing through the expansion of credit by global hedge funds to banks, who in turn lent private mortgages to householders, which were then securitized in the form of mortgage-backed securities, essentially homes traded on the stock market. While not immune to the securitized mortgage phenomenon, loose lending practices by banks was the primary driver of the Irish property bubble. It was in fact ordinary people who engaged in or were mere pawns in this scheme, as the government encouraged the asset-based function of a home, which could be used to fund a person's pension, among other things. This is why, even as supply increased, home prices concurrently rose, given the asset function it performed. House prices were kept at high levels due to a constant stream of cheap credit provided by banks and the monopolised control of land by speculators. When that bubble burst and the entire edifice of Ireland's so-called boom crumbled, the Irish state proceeded to bail out banks that misled them about their solvency, having exposed themselves to properties that were now considered worthless. The housing crash of 2007 to 2008 and the response to that crisis contextualises the current dilemma of an entire generation priced out of the housing market, along with mortgage holders beholden to Vulture Funds and non-bank entities. The steps taken by the Irish government to increase property prices after the sudden plunge in residential values simply continued the policy of financialising the housing market, with little regard to the systemic issues that caused the crisis in the first place. The invitation of Vulture Funds, the gifting of public land to private entities, the cessation of domestic bank lending, and the selling of property assets to private equity firms via NAMA all contributed to unaffordable housing and the creation of a new class of absentee so-called credit servicers masquerading as mortgage owners. This was done through the establishment of a so-called bad bank known as NAMA, which disposed Irish lending institutions of their bad loans, and the establishment of rates which would assist NAMA in deleveraging its portfolio to focus on residential property. From 2014 to 2016, NAMA sold over €50 billion worth of distressed loans to investment funds. According to the United Nations, 90% of these loans were sold to US hedge funds, private equity, and or vulture funds. But what is a vulture fund? It's a word that gets tossed around quite frequently. As their name implies, vulture funds are investment firms who prey on assets, in this case homes, with people in them, typically at low prices, before flipping the land and properties. This scheme would be facilitated by NAMA, who sold the assets or loan portfolios to these funds. Meanwhile, private equity firms are private companies that gather investors' money to look for something to invest in that's usually not publicly traded. The company then gathers these little sums of money into a giant lump sum called an investment fund, a bank containing a massive amount of money. Hedge funds usually just manage their own money without the need for investors. And once the asset they invest in has been sold, a steady stream of income and profits flow as a result. Now, many of these private equity vehicles will use a structure present within the Finance Act of 1997 that allows for the establishment of so-called special purpose vehicles. These SPVs would be granted so-called charitable status, allowing them to avoid paying Irish taxes such as VAT and capital gains tax. The loan would be sold via a true sale, in which ownership and all interest in an asset is completely transferred from the original owner, in this case the bank, to another party, in this case the Vulture Fund. The buyer, the Vulture Fund, assumes all risks and benefits associated with the asset, and the seller, the bank, no longer has any rights or control over their asset. The funds then acquire the property via the Land Registry known as Teachta Dála by obtaining a folio on the property, with the SPV then turning the portfolio of mortgages into a loan. But because neither the SPV nor the Vulture Fund can service the mortgage, they transfer the legal rights of that loan over to a credit servicer. And this is where you get your Mars, your Start, your Peppers, allowing them to initiate court hearings, even though the courts are left in the dark regarding the true sale. Now, with the transfer of such large tranches of loans over a period, many of those whose mortgages switch from a bank to a non-bank entity or Vulture Fund without their consent, or in some cases knowledge, found they had little to no security. Hundreds of thousands of households now found that the bank they thought their mortgage was tied to had been allegedly purchased by a so-called credit servicer acting on behalf of a Vulture Fund. And when these credit servicers appear before the courts, they deliberately misrepresent themselves by claiming they are the owners of the mortgage with heavily redacted material, which is taken as conclusive evidence before the judge. In 2022, Pepper was responsible for 10% of repossessions, with ownership of 80,000 private mortgages in the state. Recent figures from the Irish Farmers Association indicates that between 2,500 to 3,000 family farms may be seized by Vulture Funds of land up to 150,000 acres. The heavy-handed tactics deployed by these Vulture Funds reveals what farmers may face, or what they will face, when push comes to shove. In December 2018, the McGann family were evicted from their farm in Strokestown, County Roscommon, after KBC Bank hired a British security firm, GS Agencies, to evict the tenants on behalf of the US Vulture Fund, Cabot. The security firm, which included a former British soldier who served in the Ulster Defence Regiment, punched, pulled and kicked the family during the raid. Now, as you can tell here, the numbers of orders for repossessions increased dramatically from 2014 onwards, at the very time Vulture Funds were invited into the housing market. Now, apart from Vulture Funds, the phenomenon of cuckoo funds, who buy up entire blocks of properties directly from developers, has increased dramatically in more recent years. Often these funds will purchase properties meant for sale to buy for first-time buyers and purchase them as rental properties to gain a higher yield. And we know properties owned by funds are more expensive than normal properties. According to the Central Bank of Ireland, from 2007 to 2019, homes owned by institutional investors increased the level of rents by 4.1 percentage points more than other landlords with comparable properties following purchase. The study also found that landlords within 100 metres of an institutional investor raised monthly rents by 2.3 percentage points more than landlords who were further away after an institutional investor had moved in. In 2021, 4,000 newly built homes were purchased by investment funds, representing 27% of all new supply in the country, with all non-household buyers buying half of new homes. Now that includes affordable housing bodies as well. That same year, the government implemented an increased stamp duty of 10% on investment funds that bulk purchased 10 or more properties, with exceptions for homes leased back to the state for social housing and apartments. However, these moves have proven wholly insufficient, as the rate of bulk purchase has only increased since then, from 187 in 2021, the year it was implemented, to 395 in 2022, to 623 last year. Last year, 40% of new builds were sold to bulk purchasers. In Dublin, the situation is even more profound, with 3,528 out of 5,727 homes purchased by bulk purchasers, representing 60% of housing stock. Many of these cash-strapped funds brag about how high rents are in this country. One such entity, the so-called Qualified Investor Alternative Investment Fund, who are not subject to Irish corporation tax and not liable for capital gains taxes on profits, encourage investment in the Irish property market because of such sky-high rents. One such entity, Vanke, which is based in China, stated the Irish population is growing fast and the new land available for development are also very limited, meaning property prices in Ireland are set to continue rising, before adding that investment property in Ireland is certainly an attractive option, with small apartments located in Dublin earning gross yield of 7 to 10%. I mean, think of that statement for a moment. While my generation is struggling to pay rents, working day in and day out to stay in a property we'll never own, these funds are bragging about how beneficial it is for their balance sheets. So what am I calling for in this report? I'm not going to pretend I have all the solutions. I can barely get myself out of bed in the morning, so let alone solve the housing crisis, but there are a few recommendations in this report that I feel are worthy of consideration and discussion. So first one is a ban on foreign purchasers. So what I'm calling for is the introduction of legislation that prohibits non-resident buyers from the bulk purchase of existing residential properties. Currently, investment funds who engage in bulk purchases of 10 or more properties face a stamp duty hike of 10%. This tax was implemented in 2021 following the bulk purchase by Roundhill Capital of 170 units of social and affordable homes in a Maynooth housing estate. However, these measures have proven to be insufficient. In the 2-year period following the implementation of the tax, 4,200 homes were bought by investment funds. Bulk purchasing has increased by 233% since 2021. In 2023, 4 in 10 new homes were bought by bulk purchasers. And the tax only applies to homes, not apartments, or homes leased back to the state for social housing. I think what is required is an outright ban on these bulk purchasers by funds domiciled abroad. While some may argue the state may be constrained by EU legislation, the former EU Commissioner for Financial Services, Mairead McGuinness, has said outright that the bans are justified and permitted in the general interest, and provided they are not discriminatory and are proportionate to the aims pursued. I think by implementing this ban, Ireland would be following several other English-speaking common law jurisdictions, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Canada recently announced a 2-year extension to their ban on foreign purchasers on the basis that for years, foreign money has been coming into Canada to buy up residential real estate, increasing housing affordability concerns in cities across the country, and particularly in major urban areas. Foreign ownership has also fueled worries about Canadians being priced out of the housing market in cities and towns across the country. I'm also calling for measures to increase housing supply, because while I feel like housing supply is this golden goose that sometimes we can't criticise, we just have to get the right supply. If we're putting out a constant stream of financialised housing supply, we're not going to address the elephant in the room, which is prices. So I'm calling for an increase in the provision of construction credit by domestic pillar banks. The whole point of NAMA was so banks would start to lend again. But we know from recent research by Peter Ryan of Ryan Research, which has indicated that Irish banks' credit to deposit ratio has declined dramatically from 77% in 2008 to 38% in 2021. This is the second lowest ratio in Europe. Indeed, bank credit advanced by domestic lending institutions is down by 87% from its peak, while credit by banks in other Eurozone countries has recovered, and countries around the world, including America. Several reports from the Construction Industry Federation of Ireland, including one in 2017 and 2021, have indicated that the industry is finding it difficult to access finance for delivery of homes. These vulture funds are essentially fulfilling the role that the domestic banks should be doing. So, what needs to be done? I think the Irish government should urge a relaxation on lending restrictions and capital requirement ratios and set strict credit targets for the well-capitalised domestic pillar banks to lend to construction development. I'm also calling for a re-examination of the Land Registry, which I touched on in the report, because as I said, Teachta Dála is currently facilitating these fraudulent misrepresentations before the courts, whereby credit servicers who act on behalf of investment funds present the portfolios that I mentioned, indicating that they are the owners of mortgages when applying for repossession, which is presented, as I said, as conclusive evidence. And when credit servicers appear before the courts requesting evictions, they usually present the heavily redacted material proving they are mortgage holders, when in fact they are just mere legal title servicers. So what I'm calling for is to ensure that no credit servicers gain access to these folios in the first place, and all sales of loans should be conducted through a synthetic sale as opposed to a true sale, whereby the originator, the bank, still retains ownership of the securitized loan. I'm also calling for an update to the EU Forbearance Directive. So this is a directive which was In 2014, the EU began legislating for forbearance to be shown in repossession cases before the courts. Initially, the wording encouraged creditors to show forbearance to debtors, but then it was updated in the legislation requiring such action. And then in March 2016, the directive called the Mortgage Credit Directive was passed by the EU Council and came into force in December 2021. Now, this directive sought to mandate so-called forbearance guarantees for those in mortgage arrears facing eviction. This would be achieved through a series of guidelines, such as requirements for verifying consumers' income, documenting and retaining information, identifying and preventing misrepresented information, assessing consumers' ability to meet their obligations under the credit service agreement, and considering allowances for consumers' committed and other non-discretionary expenditures, as well as allowance for potential future negative scenarios. Now, this directive was transposed into Irish law in late December 2023, 2 years after it came into force, with the central bank acting as the enforcer. But I think to address some of the shortfalls in the current directive and how repossessions are litigated going forward, what's vital is that litigants in these repossession cases are entitled to free legal aid, which they are currently not entitled to. We must ensure that consumers are familiar with the directive before entering legal proceedings, because there's a lot of jargon in there that I feel like anyone couldn't really understand. And then I hope to apply the forbearance to non-performing loans sold before the transposition of the directive in 2023. Remember, that was only late last year. And to performing loans. Because currently, the directive does not apply to performing loans originated by credit institutions or to the sale of non-performing loans originated by credit institutions which take place before the enactment of the law. And then we must ensure that the central bank, in its capacity as the enforcer and or regulator of this directive, is equipped with the necessary regulatory tools and sanctions to ensure that judges abide by the directive, credit servicers do not misrepresent ownership of mortgages. Because right now, the Central Bank of Ireland seems to be relying on enforcing the directive on a case-by-case basis. This is wholly unreliable and will not provide sufficient safeguards for consumers. I just feel like there is no obstacle that the Irish people cannot meet. We are a country who, despite the odds, has overcome many challenges and come out the other end. Whether it's building a world-class energy system in Ardnacrusha in the 1920s or a massive home building scheme in the 1930s, there's no reason why the quote-unquote richest country on earth cannot pull the rug from underneath the Vulture Funds, preying on innocent homeowners, and finally allow generation rent to find a place to call home.